Hello, and welcome to another episode of CISO Tradecraft, the podcast that provides you with the information, knowledge, and wisdom to be a more effective cybersecurity leader. My name is G. Mark Hardy. I'm your host for today, and I'm joined by two amazing people here, Cyndi and Ron Gula. And we're going to have a fantastic discussion on a lot of what they've done and where they're going, and I'm sure you're going to love that. But quickly, a quick word from our sponsor, Risk 360. They're a cybersecurity technology and consulting firm. They work with high growth technology firms to help leaders build, manage, and certify security, privacy, and compliance programs. They publish weekly thought leadership webinars and download resources like budget and assessment templates. Take a look at some of their great information at risk360.com/resources. That's risk3sixty.com. Anyway, back to the show. Cyndi, Ron, thank you for coming on board and welcome.
G. Mark, good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and again, I thank you for being over at your home a couple of weeks ago, and enjoyed sitting out in the back and cigars and everything else like that. And of course, last night we're on another call, and the two of you look like you're out in the backyard enjoying your cigars as well. So nice to know that we have that in common, but hopefully a little bit more as well. So for our audience who may not be familiar with who you are, would you mind? Let's start with Cyndi. Tell us a little bit about like who you are and where you came from and your background.
Yeah, well, thanks. Great to be here. So I have a little bit of a different story. I grew up in Western New York, very rural. I graduated with 39 people in my public school class. So it was very small, very farmland. And then in addition to that, I was the youngest of 8 children. So very competitive, very curious all the time, and went to Alfred University. So my degree is actually ceramic engineering. So my degree is in glass engineering and science. So I'm a material scientist by trade. But when I worked at Syracuse, China, in Syracuse, New York, happenstance, I got set up on a blind date and met my voluntarily related
Wow.
sidekick here. So
Sidekick. I like that. But not great.
we are on the side. So,
Yep.
you are a sidekick right now.
It's like Ronald Reagan introducing his roommate, Nancy, all those years ago at the press
Oh,
dinner.
my goodness.
And yeah, so I like the Western New York part. I'm from there as well. Eldest of only 6 children, so mom wasn't quite as active. But anyway, yeah, glad to have you on the show. And of course, you had a chance to meet this guy, Ron. Ron, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So I'll just pick up to when Cyndi met me. So I gave her homework because I was working at the NSA and she's like, what do you do? And I'm like, no such agency. And she's like, what's that? And it just kind of shows how much cyber people kind of live in a bubble, so to speak. So I gave her a book called The Puzzle Palace, another one called The Cuckoo's Egg, Cliff Stoll. And she's like, great, I got homework, which is fun.
You forgot the best part.
Yeah.
When I asked him what he did, he said, oh, I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you.
I actually said that.
And again, being in Syracuse, New York, north of New York City, I was like, are you in the mob? And that was a little bit easier for me to understand than that he worked at the National Security Agency, which I had no idea what that was, what they did, and why it was important.
Yeah, the no such agency. I mean, I remember I got recruited to go there and actually had orders in hand back in 1984 to go over to NSA. And I think I mentioned this before on one of the other shows, but my detailer in Washington gave me a nasty call. Lieutenant, what are you trying to do? I said, I want to go to NSA. He said, what are you going to do there? I want to do computer security. And here's a quote for the ages. The Navy has no need for computer security. You're going to go back out to sea. And that led to my departure from active duty and ultimately going into the consulting. But you were with the Air Force, correct?
Yes, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I actually got into flight school called the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training down at Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas. And even the last person in that class would have got an F-16, an F-4, F-15, something like that. But when you turn the plane, the tiny little trainer airplane, that's still a jet, but it blacked me out like around 3-4 Gs. That's not a good quality to have. I tell that story quite a bit, but I sort of grew up still a big fan of aviation. I play digital combat simulator. I think we got like 4 or 5 drones here. We got like a Chinese drone, which is kind of cool. So a lot of fun.
You get to monitor the telemetry that comes out of that thing with the equivalent of a Wireshark and see.
We just don't attach it to the house.
Exactly. So in going to the Air Force, instead of going into the aviation program, you ended up in what career track?
So the actual career track was communications. Like I forget my AFSC, but it was basically communications. And there was no cybersecurity thing. I mean, cyber
Right.
command didn't exist back then. And basic communications officer school, which I attended down at Keesler Air Force Base, was really basic, right? They talked about things like phone switch capacity, like we all can't call each other at the same time, like basic information theory about how to make things work and stuff like that. That was a really good basis because I was already a double E and I wanted to basically learn how everything worked, right? Satellite communications, the red switches, the internet was something new back then. And I had a love for UFOs. And I said, if I'm going to go learn about UFOs, I want to go to the National Security Agency. Now, of course, I was wrong about that, but that's how I ended up at the National Security Agency.
Interesting. I know each of us have had Richard Thiem on our shows, and of course, Richard's done a lot of research over the years into those as well, and we could probably go in an entire different direction there. But yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to remember now how I ended up at NSA, actually interviewing and then doing all the fun stuff in the poly and things like that. And we used to kind of joke that they put up a tombstone in your hometown, and then everybody disavows the fact that you're living someplace in Maryland on the other side of the Potomac from the other three-letter agency. But so that could have been a career. And the Air Force represents a viable career pattern, and it's a great opportunity for both professional growth as well as feedback. But yet, you chose not to stay full time in the military. What went through your head getting to that point?
Yeah, if you look at what Cyber Command does now, and you think about the role of the National Security Agency and not spying on people, a lot of the work I did at the NSA was very similar. Like we wanted to help the people defend themselves. There's a security mission and whatnot. But there's a fine line between defending yourselves and telling people about 0 days that maybe we're using to defend, which is what they kind of coined that term forward. So I just didn't really think I had the best opportunity staying in and decided to go out and try to do more stuff commercially and ended up at BBN and I learned all about rapid product development. And then after that, I went to this company called US Internet Networking, which is one of the very, very first cloud companies. Learned all about that. And then came home one day and Cyndi said yes to the second best question, which was, hey, I have an idea to start a company. And we started Network Security Wizard, which did the network intrusion detection with the Dragon IDS.
So, Sydney, that was your idea then to go out on your own. Just material science wasn't working for you, the class? Or
Well, the interesting thing, so in New York State, there was a lot of material manufacturing positions.
Corning glass is what comes to mind for
There you
me.
go. And Syracuse, China, Buffalo, China, Oneida, China, there was a lot of manufacturing. And so when Ron asked me to move to Maryland, I said, sure. But when I got to Maryland, there's not a lot of manufacturing. So there was a bit of a meandering trying to find different jobs. I actually temped at one position, which was great because I did HR, I did billing, invoicing, filing, just anything that an engineer would not necessarily have access to. I did it under a temp agency. And so when Ron came home and said, hey, I got an idea for a company, I was like, well, those business people were out drinking and smoking and still managed to pass their classes. And I knew how hard my engineering classes were. So I'm like, got to be a piece of cake. So we got an accountant, got a lawyer, and then started the company. And so I did everything but coding with the company. I actually did program. I programmed in Fortran and Pascal. So I learned really early, I don't like coding.
But you mentioned some background about doing kind of the, if you will, support functions for a small business, any size business really, the HR, doing the accounting, payroll, and things like that. And in a way that almost puts you like two people back to back in a bar where you're looking at different skill sets. Did you find that the two of you had a lot of overlap or were you complementary? And if so, how did you figure that out that it was going to work? That you wouldn't be, for example, two blind people wandering into the same ditch?
Yeah, no, it was very, very complimentary. Again, Ron really liked to code. I didn't like to code. We had conversations really early on where our lanes were and the trust factor regarding how much and who would you trust more, because we both had the same outcome intent is being successful. So we were very supportive of each other, but we also had lots of conversations regarding this is my lane, and we would have conversations regarding how to get past that. And a lot of times those conversations were over wine and cigars. So
It all kind of came crashing down one day, though. We were at a SANS conference and Cyndi was kind of like, all right, it was just me and her, two people at the company, and we're doing booth duty. And I'm like, look, people aren't going to come up and ask anything super technical at a conference. This is basically network IDS. We run Linux. We can do 10 megabit. We're reaching 100 megabit, which at the time was very fast speeds. Literally, the first person comes up to Cyndi and says, "How do you handle overlapping packet fragments for evasion attacks?" And it was like, meet Rob.
Yeah, let me go drag this other guy over here and answer that. But yeah, that's kind of the thing. Any of us who've done shows and things like that, because I did a lot of product companies, but not the opportunity that you had had to get it going. So, of course, one of the challenges I face, like everybody else as an entrepreneur, is how do you get that first customer? How do you go from a bright idea to maybe a meeting with a lawyer and getting the paperwork set up? You don't just sit back and wait for the phone to ring. You've got to go out and hunt them down and catch them and eat them. How do you get that thing off the ground?
Well, the late '90s, early 2000s were a lot different than now. So open source wasn't a big thing, but we had a free download. We had something called Dragon Squire you could download and run, and that was fairly innovative at the time. There weren't a whole lot of network intrusion detection systems that did that. We were active on, there were a variety of mailing lists out there. If you think of that as a form of social media, we were very active on that, sharing updates, attacks, that sort of thing. And at that time, the world was doing network intrusion detection for the very, very first time. Our friend Marty Rush wrote Snort, we released that. You had internet security systems going out and combating with network ICE. You had network flight recorder, Marcus Raynham. And you had, of course, the Will Group guys from Cisco doing all sorts of stuff in this area. So there was a lot of, we're better than these guys. They're better than us. There's a lot of stuff, but what really did it for us is there was NSS, wasn't NSS, it was Network World Magazine. And Greg Shipley, who's over at InQtel now, he did an evaluation after we ran Dragon on the Capture the Flag network at DEF CON, which if you think about that, doing that in the early 2000s was pretty freaking cool.
Late 90s.
Late 90s. That really got us a lot of credibility and a lot of word of mouth. And when you're a two-person company going to six persons, getting a $50,000 contract, $100,000 contract, more than that even, that's all you need to be successful. And we jumped on that, supported those customers, and we had a great time with it.
And one of the other things was universities were at the leading edge of technology. The people who worked at the universities were seeking and very accepting of the new thing versus the established. And so some of our first companies or first customers were universities, very well established universities that saw the power and the product, the solid product that we were putting out, and they were able to use it in a way that the other commercial products they could not, because they were very closed systems. It was a lot
Mhm.
of trust us. We're telling you what you're doing. Whereas Dragon, we really allowed people to write their own signatures and come up with their own ways to hunt. And that was a very attractive idea at the time.
And that was also a big reason it was popular. And it really taught us as we went on to Tenable, and even now as we're investing in companies, nobody's perfect. And if you have closed signature rule system, you have to have a customer support issue when you have a false positive. But if you have an open system, you actually can get feedback from your users. They can correct your rules. There's somebody out there who's probably smarter or has a different application or version than you do, and you can get that feedback. And that was something we had. It was a commercial system, but the rules were, you could read them. And, that some of those rules showed up in some other people's products, but for the most part, I wouldn't change our outcome at all. We didn't have to raise any venture capital. We had deployments at the DoD. We had a big deployment at AOL, which I think we can say now since they're owned by whoever. But we had some really large deployments for a 8-person company. Stack. 8, 6. That's why she ran HR.
6.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get to the point. So two questions come to mind. And again, I'm trying to think in the role of people who are out there thinking, I want to try to do my own thing. And I've got this great idea. And you've either got a partner, whether it's a spouse, which is really wonderful, or you're on your own. But you get to the point where your workload is building up, and you're like, I can't add more hours to my week. So you had indicated you went from 2 ultimately to 6 more people. How do you make your first hire? What goes in? Are you hiring a developer? Are you hiring a salesperson, marketing, HR? What's that first step toward getting off the ground as a beginning entrepreneur?
Well, One of the big things that we did early, and I really think companies should think this, is make your product easy to deploy and easy to use. When you have that, then the sales product is not as much important early on. So we hired developers, and Ron, based on his experience, had great people he worked with, and they were great to us and decided to work with us again. And so those developers just focused on that product. So once the product was usable, the sale became easier because we weren't convincing people. It was the people using the product would tell two friends, you got to try this, you got to do this. And if you make it easier to use, then those early adopters are becoming your QA. They're becoming embedded. They're now involved in your success, and they become great customers and they become great evangelists. And so the sales process just starts growing from that point.
So
I
it's
think
really about getting it right to begin with, and if
yeah,
you do so, then it'll start to take care of itself as you go down the runway. And I guess the second question that came to mind is, at some point in time, you moved on from network security wizards. Did somebody come out of the guy with a trench coat and a checkbook with a lot of zeros and said, "I'm going to make your day," or was it a more deliberate, "Hey, let's do some sort of a transition or exit"? Once you get to that point
yeah.
and you move on?
So it's a lot of the early times we did with Network Security Wizards, and then of course it eventually led to starting Tenable.
Right.
It really informs what we're doing now with the investing side. So when we started Network Security Wizards, we didn't raise any venture capital, and I had two people tell me two interesting things. One was a former NSA senior leader who says you can't do sniffing; the world's going to be encrypted, and that might become true, but even 20 years later, it's not true. And the second thing was, wow, if you raised venture capital, you could have made a lot more money. And the thing is we share with our employees, but frankly, when you found a company, Cindy and I own most of that. And if you can imagine somebody buying it for double digits, that kind of changes our life. And we didn't have anybody to answer to except our customers and our employees and each other. So that was pretty good. So we had three offers. We went with Enterasys Networks. And there was a spin out of Cabletron is what Enterasys was. They were a switch company. And I really felt that putting network intrusion detection into switching fabric was an important thing. It was because it was, to me, it was easier to do than putting agents everywhere. And if you look at the world today, completely wrong, right? Switches are dumb and people have CrowdStrike and Sentinel-1 everywhere. But we went with Enterasys and we learned a lot from Enterasys.
Yeah. So they were a hardware company and we were a software company, and it was square peg, round hole with the operation side. So we taught them a lot regarding how and why software, how you get it deployed, demonstrated the margins, and really started to make our worth known. And a lot of those switch engineers and routing engineers wanted to come and learn more about our software and became really good at the engineering and deployment of software versus just the hardware solution, which in the late 90s was kind of the mantra.
Right. So so you reach this point and you go, okay, fine, we've done an exit, and you can do a little bit of a happy dance when you look at the bank account. Yeah, but some people who don't understand what it's like to have the fire in you, they want to go build something, would say, well, then why don't you just go off and buy some little island someplace and sit back and drink pina coladas till you get old? And the answer is, of course, no. This is what gives meaning to life. And so then came Tenable. What was the genesis for that, and how did that get going?
So it's an interesting story. So the gentleman who led the business development effort to acquire Network Security Wizards for Enterasys was Jack Hubbard. So Jack was in the M&A group of Enterasys. We got to hang out together, and we were kind of talking about different ideas. And there was no sort of grand plan to go start a public company at that point. And we started having kids around that time. And I kind of said, look, I think I got an idea here that we can work on it with Jack. And it took off pretty quick. So we started Tenable Network Security very quickly. Cindy was back in the office working on all
Operation.
that stuff. Basically, Jack and Cindy really kind of ran, I think, most of the company the first 10 years or so. But in many ways, Tenable was the opposite of Network Security Wizards in that we were detecting attackers and trying to stop them through prevention and alerting. But Tenable was basically pointing out all the ways they could break in. So Tenable was very much a larger problem set of trying to measure compliance, measure security, count your assets. And if you look at where we are now with like the NIST cybersecurity framework or even basic compliance like PCI and HIPAA, none of that existed in 2002 when we started. And then another thing that happened, which again wasn't planned, is Dragon. We had an integration with Nessus. Renaud Darrison. We did vulnerability correlation. Renaud was the author and founder of Nessus. He joined us as well. So we quickly were able to get to market with this open source product Nessus, but this commercial solution that solved an amazing amount of large and small enterprise vulnerability management processes.
And one of the things that we had when we started Network Security Wizards, being husband and wife, we got labeled mom and pop shop.
Yeah.
And investors didn't want to invest in husband and wife teams. And so, whereas we didn't need money when we did go out to look and test the market, we were not getting a warm reception. And if you remember the late 90s, there were actually a couple companies that had pretty nasty divorces where the people were married. And so there was a lot of gun shyness with that. So when we started Tenable, I said, you know what? I don't want to go through that again. The three of you be the named founders, but I'll do all that business stuff and take care of operations again. So that's how the four of us started Tenable.
And then use your maiden name or something like that in the presentations, and maybe they don't draw the connection.
Even when we were out towards the end of my time at Tenable, we were out raising money for the last really large round that we did. I got called out in a meeting, like you guys are a mom and pop shop. And I really didn't understand where this was coming from because, Cyndi wasn't in the deck, wasn't in on the main website. And it was some of our competitors had seeded that kind of information. They knew we were raising and stuff like that. So life is life.
Yeah. And it was great because Ron would be like, just come in and meet Cyndi. And they're like, oh, okay. Got it. Now we understand that it's not a by title only kind of thing.
You raised an interesting topic there, and the idea is that someone else is going to try to spoil your affairs. You're there, and of course, a lot of times we think, hey, if I can just get the product to run, get the compiles, and that works. Then I got to get a customer to buy, and then if I can go ahead and get the marketing and everything like that. But it's almost like in the military, you used to say the enemy gets a vote, and you can have this grand strategy and this great plan, but it doesn't survive contact with the enemy. And it seems that in business, other companies, for better or worse, are going to see themselves as an opposition. At some level, you're below the radar and they don't care. But when do you get big enough that all of a sudden they look at you and go, we got to do something about these guys?
Well, when we were below the radar with Dragon, we were at a SANS intrusion detection conference and we had a competitor sitting right next to us. And somebody came up and we didn't happen to be there and said, Ron and Cyndi? He goes, yeah, they're brother and sister. And last name, and they're really good. But then later on, they're like, obviously we're not brother and sister, but they're looking at us kind of crazy, right? So there's a lot of frenemies out there, and we've always learned that there's frenemies. We should know who you're competing against and whatnot. A lot of times that only happens at the founder level, the CEO level. When you have a sales team engaging another sales team, we've actually had situations where we were like, you cannot. I've had to pull people like, you cannot go to that other booth and antagonize this other company. And by the way, if they come over here, make sure this is a safe space and whatnot. There's things like that happens, which is really interesting. And then of course, what happens at customer sites when the other vendor isn't there, God only knows. But we hear all sorts of rumors about what's been said false and what's been said exaggerated. And it's interesting times. People just don't buy the best product. They get sold and they get bought.
And culture means a lot. And so from a point of view, we know what we can control, we know what we can't control, and therefore we really try to drive that down into anyone that we work with. And the reality and the result of that is we have lots of people who would continue to work with us again and again. And so that speaks volume to the quality of character and beyond what anyone else tries to define us. And we just think it's important to live that way.
And I think you've hit on a key point is the culture of the organization. Now, in the military, we call it the command climate. And as a commanding officer, you're responsible for that. And a lot of times you'll inherit something from a prior boss. And the analogy I do are two destroyers made at the same shipyard at the same time, and they're identical copies. But this one's a rust bucket, and this one's winning all the awards and got great looking sailors. And you come back 5 years later, 100% turnover. This one's still a rust bucket. And this one's great because over here, oh man, what did you do wrong to get assigned to this ship? Versus you are on the best ship in the Navy. This rocks. You're going to love it. So as founders, you get to set that level of culture, which is a really unique privilege, but it's also a great responsibility. So, for people thinking of doing their own thing, what do you think are important elements of culture that allow both people to want to persist as well as to allow the organization to succeed?
So there was a couple things. I'm sure you'll think of a couple here as well. But as we were growing up in Maryland, it wasn't the fact that we were a company that made money and had customers. It was that we would get typecast. Oh, you're an East Coast company. You're not VC backed, so therefore you must be doing services. You're Fed Gov. And at the time we first raised $50 million from Excel Partners, we had $50 million in the bank. And people were stunned that we were that big and doing a product company and doing SaaS. But the big reason we did that raise was so we could recruit people from Northrop Grumman, Booz Allen. People looked at going to work for a 100-person company or 200-person company as like a risky thing. Another thing that was back in the day is people were starting to do this experimentation with, well, 4-day work weeks, or IT people can do their projects on Friday and that kind of thing. And we always kind of were experimenting with things like that, but we never did free lunch. We did like Thursdays, we did lunches. We all tried to eat together. Of course, in 2023, that's kind of a hard thing when you think of everybody working all over the place and all the benefits that we give to IT people and developers now and whatnot. But that helped us do culture. And we did a lot of fun events. Like our picnics were always great. We started doing movies. Like that's pretty commonplace right now. Let's take a company to the movies and stuff like that. But in like the early 2000s, I really felt it was sort of like if you have kids, you want to show your kids like the same things you did when you were their age. And I kind of felt like that's kind of how we treated the company, very much family, very much enabled. And to the point, this is public out there. All that money we raised at Tenable was secondary. So we had a number of meetings where we called everybody into a room and we basically said, you can sell your stock. And we created some millionaires. We created some people who just paid off their houses. We had people who rolled it to the IPO. And a lot of those people stayed and worked with us and they're still at Tenable, believe it or not. So I'm sure you have some other thoughts.
Yeah, and trust and respect are big culture, foundational pieces. And the idea that any one person is going to solve everything is not going to work. So giving that trust of, I did all legal, I did all sales or HR, but I hired people to replace me to then take those things over and do those. And I trusted that they would do a good job, and they appreciated the freedom to step into that position and actually fully exercise their capabilities. And I think Ron was really good at that as well. When we would hire a developer or engineer, it was very much, this is what I expect you to do, test it out a little bit, and then really start allowing them to grow into where they wanted to be. So executive assistants we would hire, they wouldn't stay in those positions because they'd get to learn the company a little bit more and then say, hey, I want to go to sales. I want to go into customer success. I wanted QA support. We were very much encouraging people to get comfortable with the rest of the company and see if they did want to do something different and pivot and expand their own career. And one of the things that we did with Thursday lunches is we said, there's only one rule. You can't sit with people that you work with on a day to day. So we had our salespeople sitting with QA. We had our engineers sitting with finance. And it really allowed to break down a lot of those silos and a lot of those ideas that they're different. I can't talk to them. And it really helped build culture.
Now you find yourself in a role at Gula Tech Adventures, which adventures, I should say. I mean, I tend to think of adventures, but it's really an adventure. So A, I love the name. But B, what you're at a point now is you got a couple of things going on. You're looking at startups. You're hearing a lot of pitches and things like that. And when I was over at Sand Hill Road out in California, just piles and piles of these things. When I was talking to the VCs out there, But what do you look for now as a investor in a startup? What actually, how many plans do you see a year, and how many do you think you actually want to move on? And what's the differentiation?
So when we came out of Tenable, we did 3 investments. We lost money on 2 of them, and we made more than enough to come back from the third one. And we said, look, we can do this. This is what it looks like. And same kind of attitude, right? We're not perfect. We're not going to be everything we invest in is not going to touch the Midas touch. But we started doing basically philanthropy and investing as novices, right? We were writing small checks and trying to help out. And very, very quickly, we were like, okay, we actually have the resources to write bigger checks. So we do write multi-million-dollar checks and sit side by side with some of the big cyber venture funds. Crunchbase tracks us and whatnot. But we said this is an adventure because investing is only one thing. We try to support policymakers at the state level and the federal government level, and we try to support the nonprofits as well. And when we do the nonprofits and the companies, we really look for 5 things. We want to know what problem they solve. We want to know how they solve it. We want to know, can they do this? They have some proof. We want to know, like, what's the ask? What are they asking for us, right? What kind of help? Is it money? Is it time? And then finally, what's their vision of success? And we often find a lot of companies where we like the problem space, but their vision of success is wrong, or their money is asking for is wrong, the time commitment's wrong, not a good fit for Gula Tech Adventures. But we're also looking at that through the context of trying to fix cyber. So if somebody's trying to bring us a new endpoint company, we're probably not going to invest it because the world's got CrowdStrike and SentinelOne. But when we met Huntress Labs, for example, and their focus is bringing endpoint EDR to they say the other 99%, but basically small business all day will do stuff. So if it's a new market, we think that's great. And if it's cutting edge tech, we think that's great too.
And the founders do matter a lot, just from a point of view of coachability and culture. It is tough to have one founder be controlling of everything. And so to see a dynamic of how founders work together and splitting duties, it just gives you a really good idea regarding their growth potential. Because if they don't see around the corner, we kind of do, and be able to tell them, I know that this seems like it makes sense today, but 10 months from now, you're going to run into this problem. If you structure it this way, it's going to be much better. And so those who listen versus those who push back and my way or the highway, we have the luxury of not having to ride all the rides at the amusement park. And then if something doesn't fit in our wheelhouse, not necessarily culture or anything else, we can pass it to other VCs that we know are interested, and this would be a little bit down their alley more than ours. We have a great relationship because we want people to be successful. We want them to solve the cyber issues, but we also want them to have a great time and journey and experience that we've had, and then hopefully to turn and burn and do that again.
Right. And it's last time I checked, I've counted 18 successful exits. And so that's an amazing record. And I count another 34 portfolio companies just hitting the website. And so as you look at kind of the funnel, hey, I've got a business plan. Hey, I've talked to you about it. I'm interested. Might even get funded to the point where you get a second round to end up. What's the cut down? Is this sort of like getting into professional sports where, hey, I'm playing baseball on the sand lot when I'm in ninth grade, so I'm going to go ahead and make the major leagues? Well, 1,000 to 1 odds against, but some people do. How does that kind of work out?
So sometimes you fall in love with the technology more than the team. Sometimes the team more than the technology. Sometimes it's the market space, but increasingly with the success rate that we've had and the portfolio we have, we're not doing like another 15 investments right now, right? I mean, today in 2023, we're kind of coming off this glut I should say it wasn't a glut, it was kind of a slog, if you will, but where venture investing didn't happen. Most VCs focused internally on their funds, making sure they survive Silicon Valley Bank, make sure they survive, they got to cash flow positive, that they got to, I mean, it's a whole new, a lot of young VCs. This is a new time for them because they are trying to get companies to cash flow positive and really make tough decisions. Like, should I exit now and change my life? Or should I wait till maybe 2024, 2025 and at a zero in my exit. So it's very interesting times right now. So within that environment, we're not taking on a lot of new companies. The last one we did was a Taurus here. It's one of these CNAP cloud security posture management products, basically everything source code in the cloud. We did that earlier this year. We've looked hard at probably about 4 companies, and I don't, they've already, it's not a surprise. We've already told them we're not investing, but I mean, I've got probably 4 or 5 pitches a week, and we've got about 5 people with us, or total with us at Gula Tech. And a lot of them get pitches, and it's interesting times because you get to see the wave of AI, for example, right now. You get to see the wave bringing enterprise tech to the managed service provider market, and it's fun times.
And we've also made the choice as an organization that we're not going to invest in similar technology just because we think it's competitive, and in general we want to make sure that our portfolios are complementary and not competitive. Other funds would do that. So there is sometimes great technology that again, that's a great idea and they're going to be successful without us. Let's make some introductions and help them win, but we don't have to, like, we just choose not to participate on that one.
I just got to wonder, have you seen a business plan yet that you concluded was written by a generative AI engine and somebody was just trying to throw this at you?
I don't think I've seen that. I think it's coming. I really think it's coming. There are what you can detect is when a banker writes the presentation for the company. There's nothing wrong with this, but you can tell when a founder didn't write the pitch, and then you meet the founder, and that could be a contributing factor to wanting to get involved because maybe the founder will accept your help. On the other hand, maybe the banker is not presenting the founder's vision, and you need to talk to that founder, that sort of thing. So yeah, no AI generated companies yet. I'm sure it's going to happen. We haven't seen it.
That we know.
Sounds good. Now, any secrets that you guys have found about working together as spouses and being able to essentially 168 hours a week potentially is not getting any time off? And I know for some people that sort of sounds, at least early on in a marriage, it sounds like, wow, what an amazing dream. And then as you get older, a lot of us are kind of happy to have that space apart. And you probably need something just for mental health. But at the same time, you've connected at a level that's rare in my observation in life. And is there any wisdom that you've gained from that that you might find that might be
Like
valuable?
the swim lanes, the stay in your lane, so to speak. What are we working on stuff together? We don't have a common office. I mean, we're sitting side by side right now because I handle the IT and the podcast. Like, she handles like legal NDA. That's her. Like, I don't do that kind of stuff. And that's just an example of that. But the reality is even with the 30 companies we're in, we're also still volunteering. Cindy's doing a little bit more volunteering than I am. But when you do board work, when you even for these nonprofits and stuff, you're available, but you're not directly responsible. So you get to spend husband and wife time together. You get to do that, and if somebody needs to have a call, you have that call. And it's that's the way you need to go and do it. And some of these VCs we talk to, they're calling the CEO every other day, and that's not our style. And that can be really counterproductive in a lot of ways. But what would you add to that?
Yeah. Early on, somebody had said to Ron, and he repeated it to me, is that when you get married, you wake up every day and make a choice to be married. So every day you choose that. So I kind of look at it every day. I choose to work together. And when you have a positive forward idea and attitude, it certainly makes it easier that I'm stuck in this position and I'm not feeling fulfilled. So if you get to that where you're waking up, you're like, yeah, you know what? There's just something missing, or that's when we know to talk to each other. That's when we know that it's going to spiral into a bad or worse condition. But if you're waking up and do I choose it today? And if all the times it's yes, then it's a lot easier to go ahead and continue saying yes.
And I think that's great. So again, two thumbs up on that one. And I hope some people also, if they get to that point, they say, hey, I should not be working on my exit strategy. I ought to be working on my success strategy to be able to get back. What's next for you guys? I mean, you're off there, you were doing the Gula Tech Adventures, et cetera. Is there another stage coming up at some point, or this is working for you and you're going to be riding this horse for a while?
I think the entire venture capital community is looking forward to 2024 and 2025 when the companies out there are going to start doing M&A and getting some exits. So there just hasn't been that much, and that'll be interesting. So we're looking forward to that. Also looking forward to cyber is getting more and more prominent. It is not the number one thing on people's mind. I got to attend the State of the Union. I got introduced as a cyber investor, and literally people were just because they wanted to talk COVID, they wanted to talk jobs, they wanted to talk whatever. And Chris Inglis, we had a conversation with him. He's like, "Look, cyber's not the number one thing, but it's part of everything." And I think people are realizing that. So, what does 2025, 2026 look like when you have a more educated public, where your doctor's office, your government representative, your kids in school are all learning about data care, about cybersecurity, about this? I think there's going to be even more opportunity out there for this kind of stuff. We don't plan to change. I mean, we're still doing our foundation. We're doing $2 million grants a year. We're getting close to announcing our next grant competition as we approach the second half of this year. We plan on doing that. We plan on keeping these investments going and supporting those companies and enjoying the benefits of what the cybersecurity community has given us. And we're just trying to give back.
And knowing how much things have changed from the late 90s to 2000s, we know that things are going to change and relatively quickly. The amount of change has been increasing. The time has been shortened. So we definitely take a look at when I'm saying those, we choose to continue to do this. We look at a 5-year plan and try to satisfy it. We might take another look at a 3-year plan and really to start making sure that this is what we want to do. What have we liked with what we do? What have we not enjoyed? And then try to do more of what we like and avoid those pitfalls that we could potentially see coming or that other people have had where we don't want to be that. So we have the luxury of time, but assessing short time and moving forward as we want.
Well, we're just about done with our show. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
If anybody's watching out there and they want to learn startups, we've recorded a bunch of short 5 to 10 minute videos on our YouTube channel at Gula Tech Adventures. Of course, all the companies that we work with are at gula.tech. And I try not to this is the CISO show here, and we haven't really pitched any of the companies. And that's something like, even when I talk to my CISO friends, I don't pitch a company unless they've got a problem that we've invested in a company to solve. So if people want to learn more, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, and Gula.tech.
And I absolutely love this industry. Coming from a tangential industry into it, it's great to all be frenemies, but we're all on the same side. And it's so complex what we're trying to do, but it's so fun and it is so invigorating to continue to talk to other people and learn and really just continue to innovate and see the next thing that's coming out. So it's exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing where things go in the next 3 years.
Well, great. Well, Ron and Cyndi Gula, thank you so much for being our guests on the CISO Tradecraft podcast. I hope our audience got some words of wisdom out of that. And Gula.tech is the place to go if you want additional information. I'm your host, G. Mark Hardy. I want to thank you for tuning in. If you're following us on a YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. And if you listen to us on the podcast, give us a 5-star. Give us a thumbs up. Help other people find us. Until next time, stay safe out there.